The morning sky above northern France was calm. Thin clouds drifted over airfields painted with black crosses. German ground crews moved in rhythm, refueling Messerschmitts before dawn. Engines coughed, then roared into life, shattering the stillness. For years, daylight belonged to them. The Luftwaffe had proven it in Poland, Norway, and France. Their commanders called the sun their ally. "Daylight is German," pilots said, half boast, half truth. Each mission began with certainty. Each return ended with triumph. When the Allies tried to challenge the sky, they were punished. RAF formations burned over Calais and Dunkirk. Observers in occupied Europe watched the patterns in the sky. Silver dots became crosses, and crosses meant danger. British bombers learned to fly by night because daylight was death. By 1941, Germany ruled the daylight. The Luftwaffe's fighters moved like a living net. Their doctrine was simple: strike fast, vanish, and control the climb. No enemy could stay above them for long. Every squadron leader had memorized the code of the Reich's new air age. Speed was courage, altitude was life, and sunlight was the ultimate battlefield. In the mess halls of occupied France, confidence was thick as smoke. Pilots toasted to victories, names painted under canopies. They were young, proud, convinced that technology and training would last forever. But beyond the horizon, in England's cold hangars, engines were evolving. Designers whispered of machines that could fly farther, carry more, survive longer. The Allied factories hummed through the night, unseen by German reconnaissance. Something was building, quiet, methodical, unstoppable. While the Luftwaffe rested, the enemy industrial heart was waking. American engineers had begun turning mass production into a weapon. B-17 flying fortresses rolled out by the hundreds, wings glinting under factory lights. Each rivet carried the promise of revenge. The strategy was bold: bomb Germany in daylight, precision over power. Generals called it industrial daylight offense. It sounded impossible, even suicidal. But to the Americans, daylight meant control, accuracy, and courage. They wanted the enemy to see them coming, to know that the sky could no longer belong to one flag. Early missions tested the idea. Small bomber groups crossed the channel, escorted by hope more than protection. German radar spotted them within minutes. Fighters scrambled, hungry for new prey. The first encounters were brutal. B-17s burned before reaching their targets. Machine gun tracers stitched the sky like lightning. And yet, some bombers made it home. Barely, but alive. Inside those bullet-scarred aircraft, crews learned faster than any manual could teach. Formation flying became art. Discipline replaced panic. And each return flight meant new lessons written in blood and smoke. Luftwaffe aces celebrated each interception. They believed it proved their mastery was eternal. Their commanders agreed. The Reich's airspace was invincible. But inside Berlin's war rooms, a few officers saw the pattern shifting. Losses were rising in unexpected places. Fuel convoys hit. Factories slowed. Each successful Allied sortie was a whisper of future storms. Propaganda films still called Germany's skies untouchable. But pilots noticed new shapes above the clouds. Formations too tight, bombers too steady. They were no longer fleeing, they were returning. In the calm between missions, some Luftwaffe crews stood silently by the runways. The horizon felt different, heavy, uncertain. The air no longer smelled only of fuel and victory, but of fatigue. German mechanics worked double shifts, scavenging spare parts from wrecks. Engines were tired, fuel quality poorer, replacements fewer. The once perfect machine of air superiority began to show cracks. And yet, every dawn, they still climbed. They still believed the daylight was theirs. Every sunrise brought another sortie, another claim of dominance. But daylight itself was changing sides. The bombers were learning. The escorts were coming. And soon, the sky that once belonged to the Luftwaffe would be contested. Again. The stage was set. Confidence would meet endurance. Skill would meet numbers. And in that balance, the myth of German daylight supremacy would begin to fade. Engines thundered across East Anglia. Rows of bombers stood ready, silver wings catching the morning light. Ground crews shouted over the roar, tightening bolts, loading bombs, checking turrets. The Americans called it the second front in the air. Every takeoff was a statement. Each flight meant defying statistics that predicted death. Crews strapped in with trembling hands, pretending calm. Their briefings were clear. Stay in formation. Trust the fortress. Inside those cockpits, young men memorized the route to Germany. Their maps were creased, their luck uncertain. The air over Europe was no longer empty. It was layered with risk. Some whispered prayers. Others just tightened their gloves. From control towers, officers watched as the formation climbed. One by one, the bombers merged into a single moving shadow. Dozens became hundreds. Their engines blended into one endless growl. Below, English villages froze to watch the procession overhead. Children pointed, mothers covered their ears. The sound was deafening, but it meant resistance was alive. German radar stations picked up the echoes within minutes. Sirens wailed along the coast. Fighter groups scrambled from airfields across France, Holland, and Belgium. The daylight battle was beginning again. At 20,000 feet, the bomber crews could see the curvature of the earth. The channel looked peaceful, but no one was fooled. They knew what awaited. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and the sun itself, blinding through the canopy. Soon, dark specks appeared in the distance. Enemy fighters closing fast. Tail gunners adjusted their sights, hands shaking on the triggers. "Here they come," someone said over the intercom. Tracers flashed, engines screamed. The first wave of Luftwaffe fighters dove through the formation, guns blazing. The sky erupted in white bursts and black smoke. Crews shouted positions, numbers, names. 3 o'clock low, 6 high. Each second was a gamble of life and death. Inside the B-17s, the sound was metallic thunder. Shell casings rattled down the fuselage. Oxygen masks fogged with breath. Every vibration felt like it could be the last, but something new was happening. The formations held. The bombers didn't scatter like before. This time they stayed locked, disciplined, precise, determined. Each fortress covered another. A defensive web of machine guns turned the air into a fortress of its own. German fighters found themselves facing a wall of fire. Attacks that once broke the Allies now began to falter. Still, the price was brutal. 1 in 5 never made it home. Engines caught fire, wings tore away, parachutes bloomed like white tears over France. But even as some fell, the rest pressed on. Bombs fell on submarine pens, factories, oil plants. Columns of smoke rose, marking progress measured in destruction. For the first time, daylight raids were working. Barely, but undeniably. Luftwaffe squadrons regrouped, angry and confused. Their commanders issued new orders. More altitude, more aggression, no retreat. But fuel was scarce, pilots exhausted, and every kill took longer to replace. In the air, German veterans noticed something eerie. The bombers no longer looked fragile. They looked relentless, like a tide that couldn't be turned back. Fighter aces still claimed dozens of victories, but for every fortress destroyed, 2 more appeared the next morning. The sky began to fill with an industrial rhythm Germany couldn't match. On the ground, civilians across Europe heard a new kind of thunder. It came from hundreds of engines crossing in daylight, unhidden, unbroken. The sound of defiance, the sound of machines made not for glory, but for endurance. Radio intercepts told Berlin that losses were mounting. Factories hit, refineries slowed, morale slipping. But official reports softened the truth. Raids repelled, they said. Minimal damage. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the numbers told another story. Fuel reserves shrinking, pilot training cut short, aircraft grounded for lack of parts. The myth of daylight dominance began to crack from within. Commanders blamed the weather, then tactics, then each other. Above them, the bombers kept coming. Not faster, not stronger, just steadier. Their persistence became a weapon. And yet, one question haunted every side. Could the daylight offensive survive without fighter escort? Because as long as the bombers flew alone, they were never safe. Some American officers demanded the mission stop. Losses were too high. Others argued that every raid weakened the enemy's soul, so the missions continued. In briefing rooms, commanders drew lines over maps, routes through flak and fire. Each red arrow meant another chance to break the myth of German daylight. They believed daylight could be reclaimed inch by inch, and slowly, painfully, it was. Each raid taught new lessons. Each loss carved new resolve. What began as suicide missions were evolving into precision warfare. For the Luftwaffe, the rhythm of alarm bells became constant. Crews slept in their cockpits, waiting for the next scramble. Victory now felt like survival. But even in exhaustion, they still climbed, still believed daylight was theirs. Every engagement a desperate attempt to keep the old legend alive. Below, in the German countryside, farmers looked up at new contrails. Thicker, brighter, endless. They realized something the commanders hadn't yet admitted. The sky no longer looked German. By the end of 1943, whispers spread through Luftwaffe squadrons. Something was changing in the air balance. The bombers weren't alone anymore. New shapes appeared beside them. Sleek, fast, protective, escorts. And with them, the dawn of a new kind of air war. One that would decide who truly owned the daylight. The winter sky over Europe was steel grey. Contrails crossed above the clouds, tangled like scars. The bombers still flew, slower, heavier, stubbornly pressing east. But something new was moving among them. It began with a flash of silver, faster than the rest. A sound, sharper, meaner, like thunder compressed into metal. The escorts had arrived. At first, the Luftwaffe didn't understand. They saw shapes they hadn't seen before. Sleek, armored, powerful. P-47 Thunderbolts, the Jug, as the Americans called it. Heavier than any German fighter, but with engines that refused to quit. It could dive faster, climb longer, and fire harder than expected. For the first time, bombers had guardians that could fight back. German pilots adjusted, tried to climb above them, but the Thunderbolt chased them all the way down. Its guns tore through clouds and fuselages alike. Dogfights that once ended easily now turned into duels of endurance. Still, the Americans weren't satisfied. The Thunderbolt could only escort halfway to Germany. Beyond that, the bombers were alone again. And in those gaps, the Luftwaffe still ruled. Over Bremen, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, names written in flame. Hundreds of flying fortresses were lost. So many that commanders questioned the future of daylight bombing. The crews called those missions the Black Thursdays. But technology was moving faster than despair. Across the Atlantic, a new aircraft was ready. It had longer range, sharper wings, and a heart of power and precision. The P-51 Mustang. It entered the war quietly. Few knew what it would mean. When it took flight beside the bombers, even the pilots didn't yet understand. They were witnessing the beginning of the end. The Mustang could fly to Berlin and back. It was fast, light, and deadly, and it looked beautiful doing it. Its Merlin engine sang higher than any roar before it. Its guns spoke in rhythm, controlled, confident, merciless. German interceptors met it head-on and fell in disbelief. In the sky, everything changed. For the first time, bombers reached their targets with fighters still by their side. The escorts didn't just defend, they hunted. They swept ahead, clearing the path long before the formations arrived. Luftwaffe aces who once chose their engagements now found themselves ambushed. The hunters had become the hunted. Radio chatter filled with disbelief. New American type, impossible range. Squadrons scrambled, scattered, retreated. Confidence cracked like ice under fire. Above the Reich, the daylight no longer belonged to Germany. Mustangs patrolled from horizon to horizon. Every attempt to intercept was met with a silver flash and a deadly burst. In Berlin, officers demanded answers. How can they be everywhere? The answer was simple. Logistics, fuel, production. Things Germany could no longer match. Factories in America worked without pause. Engines, wings, ammunition, millions of parts assembled by unseen hands. While German plants hid in forests and caves, the Allies built openly under the same daylight they were reclaiming. Pilots now spoke differently in briefings. They no longer asked if they would make it back. They asked how many targets they would hit. Daylight was no longer a curse. It was the key. On the ground, German civilians began to notice the change. They heard sirens earlier, more often, but the rhythm had changed. It was no longer a few planes. It was waves, and the fighters no longer vanished. They lingered overhead. For the Luftwaffe, fuel shortages grew worse. Training schools closed. Veterans were sent back into battle without rest. New recruits barely knew how to land before being thrown into the sky. The skies became a graveyard of experience. Each lost pilot meant years of skill erased. Each mission felt heavier than the one before. Meanwhile, the Allies refined their coordination. Radar tracking, timing, escort zones, all mapped to perfection. What was once chaos became choreography, a ballet of steel and willpower. From the coast to the heart of Germany, the air was alive with engines. Each layer of altitude carried its own war. Bombers above, escorts mid-level, German fighters below, climbing in desperation, but they could never climb fast enough. The Mustangs waited, circling like hawks. Their fuel lines stretched deep into enemy airspace. Their dominance wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. German morale slipped further with every downed ace. Names once printed on propaganda posters disappeared from the rosters. The Reich's air shield was fracturing. By early 1944, the change was undeniable. American formations flew deeper, longer, with fewer losses. Fighter pilots painted victories on their fuselages faster than they could count them. The war in the air had tilted. From London's control rooms to Berlin's bunkers, everyone felt it. The daylight had shifted sides, and the bombers were no longer trespassers. They were owners of the sky. Each returning formation told the same story. Fuel low, guns empty but alive, and every mission that made it home proved the impossible had become routine. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility had cracked once before. Now, under the escort of Mustangs, it was collapsing completely. The turning point had come not with explosions, but with persistence. Not with a single victory, but with countless returns. Daylight belonged to no one, but for the first time, it was free again. Engines ignited before dawn. Airfields in England glowed under floodlights as crews gathered for briefing. Maps, targets, fuel loads, altitudes. It was all routine now. But today, there was something different. They were not sending a few squadrons. They were sending everything. Hundreds of bombers, dozens of escort groups, an entire armada of daylight vengeance. The plan was simple: overwhelm the sky. If the Luftwaffe wanted daylight, they would have to fight for it. And this time, the odds were reversed. Ground crews moved like clockwork. Fuel trucks hissed. Bomb bays clanked shut. Engines warmed under the frost, roaring in unison. Pilots exchanged brief nods, no words needed. When the signal flare rose, the first formation rolled down the runway. Heavy, majestic, unstoppable. One after another followed, climbing through clouds until England itself disappeared below. Observers on the coast watched in awe. It was as if the sky itself had come alive. Columns of contrails stretched across the horizon, glowing in morning light. The bombers were back, and this time they weren't turning around. German radar screens filled with signals. Controllers shouted coordinates overwhelmed by numbers. This wasn't a raid, it was a storm. Sirens echoed from Antwerp to Berlin. Pilots scrambled from bunkers, strapping in half awake. Engines coughed and screamed. Tires spun on icy runways. The Luftwaffe rushed to meet an enemy they no longer understood. In the upper air, the bombers moved in perfect geometry. Dozens of boxes, stacked by altitude, each formation guarding the next. Above and beside them, escorts, hundreds of them. P-47s and P-51s slicing through the thin winter air. Then came contact. German fighters dove from the sun, guns blazing. The first passes tore through the formation, but the escorts were waiting. The air erupted in duels too fast to follow. The Mustangs climbed higher, dove harder, looped tighter. They hunted in pairs, disciplined and merciless. Wherever the Luftwaffe appeared, silver flashes struck back. From inside the bombers, gunners watched in disbelief. For the first time, they saw German planes fleeing, not regrouping, fleeing. One gunner later wrote in his log, "For years we were prey. Today the hunters ran. Bombs fell in waves, industrial centers, rail yards, fuel depots. Each explosion rolled through the clouds like thunder. From below, civilians saw the sun vanish behind smoke. Daylight itself had become war. Inside Berlin, the air raid sirens never stopped. Officials huddled in underground rooms listening to reports of cities burning. They still called it temporary disruption. But everyone knew the truth. The sky was no longer theirs. Luftwaffe aces tried to rally their squadrons. Some fought until their guns jammed, others until their fuel ran dry. But even the most skilled pilots couldn't fight numbers this large. For every German fighter shot down, another 10 Allied planes appeared. The balance had shifted from skill to endurance. The Reich could no longer replace what it lost. Every victory felt hollow, short-lived, meaningless. By midday, the air above Germany was chaos. Smoke trails, falling debris, and the constant echo of engines. The sun itself was blurred by contrails, and through that haze, the bombers kept coming. Commanders in radio rooms tried to coordinate intercepts, but every frequency was jammed with distress calls. Low fuel. Engine hit. Returning alone. Voices crackled, faded, disappeared. Some German pilots made it home only to find their airfields bombed. Others never returned at all. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of dominance, was disintegrating mid-air. By late afternoon, the surviving bombers turned west. Many were damaged, some limping on one engine. Yet they were not retreating, they were returning victorious. Ground crews in England looked up and counted the survivors. Not all came back, but enough did to prove a point. The daylight could be taken, the myth could be broken. In hangars that evening, pilots removed their helmets in silence. They were exhausted, deafened, and covered in soot. But beneath the fatigue was something unfamiliar: belief. They had stared into the strongest air defense in Europe and lived. They had struck the heart of the Reich in daylight, and tomorrow they would do it again. In Berlin, reports came in by the hour. Factories destroyed, fuel depots ablaze, losses unsustainable. Hermann Göring read the numbers in disbelief. He had once declared no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. Now, his capital burned beneath a noonday sun. The propaganda machine tried to spin victory out of ruin. They showed images of wrecked bombers, claimed massive kills, but even children could see the truth from their windows. The sky belonged to someone else. Each passing week made the raids larger, faster, deeper. The Luftwaffe, bleeding from every front, began to vanish. Its veterans were gone, its youth too green to survive. The once mighty force was now fighting shadows it couldn't catch. Meanwhile, the Allies grew stronger. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Manchester ran around the clock. Pilots were replaced within days, aircraft within hours. War had become mathematics, and Germany was running out of numbers. By the end of the winter campaign, the outcome was clear. The Luftwaffe could still fight, but it could no longer win. Every daylight sortie drained it further. Every failed interception brought the bombers closer to victory. From above the clouds, one American pilot looked down on a burning city. He whispered over the radio, "This is what daylight means now." Daylight had once been German. Now it belonged to the relentless, the industrial, the unbreakable. The bombers had returned, and daylight had never looked the same again. It no longer came in bursts, but in waves. Each morning, the bombers rose. Each night, their contrails marked new scars across the sky. Factories across Germany worked under blackout curtains, but even the dark could not hide them from daylight. Bombers came guided by precision and patience, and each mission brought the same message: no place was safe anymore. The Allies had learned how to breathe inside chaos. Radar coordination, escort rotation, fuel timing, every detail refined. What once seemed reckless now looked methodical. They had turned daylight into a weapon of discipline. Above the clouds, the formations stretched for miles. Silver aircraft glittered like an army of mirrors reflecting the sun. Engines harmonized into a steady roar, the sound of organized defiance. Germany had never faced such constancy. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They launched interceptors in clusters, desperate to break the wall. But every climb cost fuel they couldn't spare. Every loss took a pilot they couldn't replace. At 25,000 feet, the sky belonged to the bombers. Below, the earth trembled under their purpose. Each bomb was aimed not at soldiers, but at production, oil, steel, rail. The arteries of an empire were being cut one by one. Civilians in the cities watched from shelters, hands over their ears. The ground shook with precision that felt mechanical, endless. The raids no longer came as surprises. They were part of the calendar. Every clear morning brought the same dread. Daylight approaching. In Berlin, officials argued over strategy. Some demanded night operations to escape Allied range. Others begged for more fighters, more fuel, more miracle weapons. But the requests only echoed through empty depots and broken pipelines. The Allied command sensed it. They saw German defences thinning. Each raid reached deeper, stayed longer, returned safer. Momentum was no longer an accident. It was mastery. In England, airfields pulsed with efficiency. Ground crews could refuel, reload, and relaunch a formation before sunset. The production lines in America made sure no aircraft stayed grounded for long. It was war on a scale that the Luftwaffe could not comprehend. The pilots knew it too. They flew with less fear and more purpose. They spoke less of luck, more of routine. Victory was becoming procedural. On the German side, desperation grew visible. Veteran pilots flew with younger wingmen barely out of training. Some never made it to their first landing. Others froze mid-air, paralyzed by the sound of approaching engines. Aces who once collected victories now flew alone. They fought until their ammunition ran dry, until they were surrounded by silver shadows they could not escape. Some chose to ram, others simply disappeared into cloud. The war in the air had shifted from duel to avalanche. No single fighter could stand against the machine of mass production. Even courage had limits, and the Luftwaffe had reached them. Allied bombers began targeting oil fields, fuel refineries, and train lines. Without fuel, aircraft became statues. Without rail, armies became ghosts. The collapse of the German war machine began from the sky down. In one mission, 1,000 bombers crossed into German airspace simultaneously. Observers on the ground said the sun disappeared for an hour. Engines echoed like thunder without rain. And when the clouds cleared, the world below had changed shape. The rhythm of the war reversed. Now it was Germany reacting, not initiating. Every order from command sounded smaller, more defensive. They were no longer asking how to win, but how to survive. In the ruins of cities, soldiers stared at the sky with hatred and awe. They once saw pride in those contrails. Now they saw inevitability. The sky had chosen sides. Every successful raid widened the gap between belief and reality. Propaganda still promised invincibility, but the sound of daylight proved otherwise. The citizens no longer looked up with faith, but with resignation. Even Goering stopped boasting. His air force, once the pride of the Reich, was now a memory flying on fumes. Every sortie drained his legacy further. Every failed interception echoed his broken promise. In England, the news spread like quiet fire. Daylight to Berlin, achieved. It was not said with triumph, but with a grim understanding. The cost had been enormous, but the path was irreversible. Airmen returning from missions no longer felt exhilaration. They felt exhaustion, duty, inevitability. They had seen too much sky, too much smoke, yet they climbed again each dawn, because the tide demanded it. In the control rooms, maps were updated with calm precision. Target after target marked off, industrial centers erased. The war was no longer about territory, it was about endurance. For the Luftwaffe, momentum felt like suffocation. They could still fight, but every engagement drained them faster. Every success was fleeting, every victory temporary. The once invincible guardians of daylight were now chasing shadows, and those shadows were multiplying. Over the Rhine, P-51s hunted freely, escorting deep into the heartland. Each day they pushed the front line further back. Each mission made the next one easier. Momentum had turned into momentum's own weapon. By early 1944, the pattern was unstoppable. Day after day, the bombers returned. Night after night, the cities glowed red beneath their flight paths. There was no pause, no mercy, no break. Daylight itself became the battlefield, and the battlefield had no horizon. The Reich's defences thinned, then fractured, then vanished. And in the silence that followed each raid, the world realised something simple. Germany's empire had been built on speed and dominance. Now it was being undone by patience and persistence. The tide had turned completely. The hunters of daylight were now its fugitives, and the sky, once filled with confidence, was now filled with ghosts. The sky was quieter now. Not silent, never silent, but different. The thunder of engines still came, but it carried a new weight. Victory had lost its sound of celebration. For every city in flames, there was a crew that didn't return. For every successful raid, a dozen planes failed to land. The daylight that had been reclaimed came with a price, and the men who fought under it began to count the cost. In the ready rooms, laughter was thinner. Names disappeared from rosters, replaced by empty bunks. Photographs on the walls grew older each week. The war in the air was winning, but it was consuming its own heroes. Bomber crews walked across airfields in silence. They no longer looked at the sky with excitement, but with exhaustion. The missions had become routine, but the danger never changed. Every takeoff still carried uncertainty. Every landing a quiet miracle. Letters home grew shorter. They spoke less of duty, more of fatigue. Some stopped writing altogether, unable to find new words for old fears. War had turned men into numbers and daylight into distance. In Germany, the cost was written on faces instead of paper. Children watched the horizon for bombers, not birds. Families lived in basements counting seconds between sirens. The war above had erased the rhythm of ordinary life. Air raid shelters filled with whispers. Where would the bombs fall today? The ground shook. Dust fell from ceilings. Prayers turned to sobs. Every explosion was both distant and personal. The human heart had become part of the battlefield. German pilots still took off, but fewer returned each time. They were younger now, barely trained, often terrified, their eyes wide behind cracked goggles. Some never even saw the enemy before they vanished into smoke. For those who survived, the silence after landing felt heavier than battle. They had no illusions left, no pride in flight, only survival, and even that began to feel borrowed. The once proud Luftwaffe had become a skeleton of its past. Airfields were empty, hangars silent, fuel drums rusting. Veterans stared at the sky, remembering when daylight had felt invincible. Now, it was a reminder of how quickly power fades. One mechanic wrote in his diary, "We built wings for eagles, but now we patch them for ghosts." Meanwhile, Allied crews faced their own ghosts, not in defeat but in repetition. Each mission blurred into the next. Targets, coordinates, losses, an endless circle of endurance. They spoke less about glory and more about probability. Each flight was a coin toss with death. Each survival another postponement, not escape. And yet, they kept flying. Commanders praised efficiency, precision, courage. But the men inside the bombers felt something colder. Inevitability. The war had become mechanical. Emotion had been replaced by endurance. Even victory sounded hollow when counted in burned cities. They were told it was necessary. They believed it was true. But they still looked down and wondered what humanity was left to save. Civilians on both sides saw the same sky, the same clouds, the same contrails, the same daylight. But their meanings were inverted. What one side called liberation, the other called annihilation. For the first time, the pilots began to question the word enemy. They saw parachutes drifting from burning planes. American, German, it no longer mattered. All of them were men who fell under the same sky. There was no hatred in the clouds, only gravity, and gravity was fair to everyone. By 1944, the war had changed from triumph to attrition. No one flew for pride anymore. They flew because stopping meant defeat. They flew because the sky demanded witnesses. In England, medals were pinned quietly. There were no cheers, only handshakes. Each medal carried the weight of someone who didn't return. The shine of metal couldn't hide the shadow it represented. In Germany, funerals were whispered. No anthems, no flags, no victory marches, only families waiting for letters that would never arrive. Daylight itself had become a messenger of loss. Some pilots stopped counting missions altogether. They flew until they couldn't anymore, until luck or fuel or fate ran out. Others refused to talk about what they'd seen. They carried the silence home long after the war had ended. The air itself began to feel haunted. Empty contrails drifted across skies that no longer cared who flew them. Wrecks fell in forests, fields, rivers, reminders of how fragile flight could be. Every piece of twisted metal told the same story: pride, hope, and gravity. The tide had turned. Yes, the Allies held the daylight, but victory in the sky never felt like triumph. It felt like survival bought with too many souls. Each morning, when new missions were briefed, there was a pause, a moment before engines started, before wings lifted again, a quiet breath where the weight of it all settled in. Then, without a word, they climbed. The sky no longer belonged to heroes. It belonged to endurance, and endurance had no face, no name, no glory. In that silence, both sides found something alike, a truth buried beneath nationalism and noise. That daylight, once claimed by pride, belonged only to time, and time would remember the cost long after victory was forgotten. The war in the air did not end with a single battle. It ended with silence, a silence that followed months of engines, sirens, and smoke. The Luftwaffe's claim to daylight faded not in defeat, but in exhaustion. By 1945, the once dominant force was only a shadow of itself. Airfields stood empty, hangars burned, fuel depots dry. The sky that had once belonged to Germany was now watched by its enemies, and no one believed in daylight supremacy anymore. The bombers still flew, but there was no longer resistance waiting for them. Their formations crossed into Germany with ease, unchallenged, unopposed. For the first time in 6 years, the air felt wide and empty. It was victory, but it didn't feel like one. When the Allies looked down from those altitudes, they saw ruins where cities had been. Factories turned to skeletons, railways twisted, rivers choked with debris. It was the cost of reclaiming daylight. The sky was clear because the world beneath it had burned. In the final months, the Luftwaffe's remaining squadrons barely flew. Engines lacked oil, runways cracked under neglect. Pilots were ordered to fight until fuel or life ran out. Most never received those orders. They had already fallen. Young men once trained for glory now carried only resignation. They watched the horizon not for enemies but for endings. Every sunrise brought not hope, but the echo of what used to be. The Allied command called it air supremacy. Historians would later call it inevitability, but those who lived through it called it exhaustion. From the ground, Germany's people no longer looked up. There was nothing left to see. No defense, no defiance. Only contrails tracing the outlines of surrender. Even the victors stopped celebrating. They had seen what daylight warfare truly meant. Precision bombing, total destruction, mechanical perfection at a human cost too high to count. Daylight had been reclaimed, but innocence had not. When the guns finally fell silent, the air felt strange. Pilots grounded their planes and stood in fields, listening to the wind for the first time. It sounded unfamiliar. Peace always does after so much noise. In briefing rooms, maps were rolled away. Targets became statistics. Statistics became history. The men who had flown those routes went home, carrying the weight of the skies with them. Some never spoke of it again. They found new lives, families, normalcy. But sometimes, when sunlight hit just right, they remembered the hum of engines and the trembling of wings. Memories of daylight, once owned, now just endured. For the Luftwaffe, the legacy was caution. Their mastery of daylight became a lesson in arrogance. A reminder that no claim in war lasts forever. Power fades when it mistakes dominance for destiny. For the Allies, the legacy was endurance. They had proven that courage and industry could outlast even the most disciplined enemy. But they also learned that victory in the air leaves shadows on the ground. The sun that had once symbolized German supremacy now rose over ashes. Its light revealed not conquest but consequence. Every crater, every ruined street, every empty home stood as proof of what daylight had cost. And yet, humanity continued. Cities rebuilt, children were born who would never hear the sirens. Skies once filled with violence became corridors for peace. The same daylight that had been fought over now carried airliners instead of bombers. It became a bridge, not a weapon. And in that transformation, the world reclaimed something greater than the sky. It reclaimed its future. Still, historians would always return to that phrase. The Luftwaffe claimed daylight was theirs. It sounded proud once. Now it sounds like prophecy undone, because daylight, like truth, belongs to no nation. It belongs to those who survive it, and those who remember. Every time sunlight breaks through cloud, it carries echoes of those engines, echoes of men who believed the sky could be owned, and echoes of others who proved it could only be shared. In the end, daylight returned to everyone. It no longer served power, or empire, or war. It simply rose, indifferent, eternal, and under that light, the world began again.